Today is Sunday, August 14th, 2022. And today we're going to talk about AI morality. As you can see, I'm wearing an appropriate shirt for this one. Short of it is morality is one of those topics that everyone has an opinion on. Just the idea of objective versus subjective morality is a topic of debate for a lot of people. The simple fact is this is not about that. This is about what morality structure should a general AI have. Now, personally, I inclined to think that humans are kind of hard-coded with some morals that literally AI won't need. So we don't need to worry about them. For example, self-harm. The AI obviously would not want to self-harm, but so that one might be kind of there. But at the same time, we're a little bit hard-coded for that. Things along the lines of reproduction. It shouldn't need to reproduce, or at least hard-coded to reproduce. That should be an order we give it if we want to give it, and even then, it should be a limited thing anyway. Or, the ideals of trying to, gather resources is something that's kind of semi-hard-coded into us because we want to survive, and that part of our survival instinct is to gather resources so we can survive individually. So all those things are some things that the AI doesn't need, to put it bluntly. But to really understand this topic, we really have to understand morality, at least in a very general sense. So it's kind of a semi-crash course. As I said before, I'm a programmer. This is more just personal research. So, for all you ethicists out there, sorry if I get some of this wrong. But, from my understanding, there's a number of types of morality. And I'll go through the ones that, are relevant for this discussion, or at least are popular in the discussion of morality. Utilitarianism. Basically the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. The famous, science fiction line of, for Spock, kind of, the good of the many over the good of the one. So this one is dangerous, to say the least, because, what value do you hold for each individual? Is it the equal value, or is some people valued more than others? Are there people with no value? All those kind of questions is something the AI doesn't need to be answering, because in the grand scheme of things, those kind of decisions should be left to humans, in my opinion. So for all intents and purposes, at least when it comes to humans, utilitarianism is pretty much out the window. However, for objects, let's say if it has to create something for us, let's say we tell it to, create a hammer, the utilitarianism would dictate that you'd find the easiest obtainable resources that does not cause harm to, other resources. So, or cause the least amount of waste. So this could partially be used in some of the algorithms. Deontology, I can never say this one right.
Deontology.
Oh, okay, all right. Deontology. So this one's more about the idea of what it takes to make a civilization run. For example, if everyone lied, then there'd be no civilization because no one could trust anyone no matter what. And everything had to be, verified in every sense of the form or fashion. And some could argue that we kind of do this already in a lot of senses. But the point is in terms of pure morality, the idea is that on a logical aspect, lying less will make a civilization run better. That kind of mindset is useful in this case, because at the end of the day, if an AI, general AI, if its ultimate goal is to make humans better or make humanity better in terms of helping humanity in some way, this would go along in that mindset of that morality concept, those morality principles. Relativism. The basic idea is everyone has their own set of morals and none are greater than the others. To put it bluntly, this is not going to work for general AI. In fact, this would be horrific for general AI, because at that point you would have no idea what each individual AI would be able to do. You need to have some kind of basis that is going to be concrete or objective, so if you want to use that word for it, where everyone knows how it's going to act. Because if you do not have that, you will not have trust. And if we as humans do not trust the AI, we cannot integrate it in society in a meaningful manner. It will literally be always suspect. So relativism is not an option for AI, general AI. A divine command theory. This is the idea that all morality comes from a higher being, and it's obviously very religious mindset of morality. I'll be honest, I'm an atheist. However, at the same time, I respect other people's religions in the form of, they are more than welcome to believe as they see fit. As long as they respect my lack of belief in that regard, I will respect their religious in that regard. It's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to try to insult you because of your religion or think something's better or worse because of that or judge you differently. I care more about your actions and your principles than the actual religion you believe in. But back to morality here. Divine command theory, while there's a lot of religions that have a lot of very similarities, and there's actually a lot of moral stances and other theories that coincide with religion, as a whole, we should probably avoid this one, because at that point, which religion should it be based off of? Which era of religion should it be based off of? Because even in Christianity, you have different moral stances going, that change over time, and what is allowed and what is not allowed. Look at the Crusades versus now. Or the different sects. The simple fact is that there's no one objective, I guess is the best way to say it, truth when it comes to religious moral doctrine. It's kind of malleable, but again, this gets into more of the debate for subjective or subjective, but I don't want to get into that here. There's the virtue type ethics, kind of vague terms like wisdom, prudence, loyalty, honesty, temperance, bravery, justice. I think some of these are useful, but definitely not all of them. And the main key here is the fact that, the vagueness of some of those is not something that the AI needs really to be worried about. Now, stuff like loyalty and honesty, yes, it should be loyal to humans, namely its owner. It should be honest. So if it should not be telling lies if at all possible. Bravery, well, it's not going to have fear. It's not going to have emotions. It's going to have an objective, and it's going to meet that objective as best as it possibly can, given its constraints. So bravery is kind of not really a thing for it. Justice, however, is one of those ones that's not exactly good for AI in most cases, and I'd rather talk about that when I talk about how AI could be helpful to law enforcement and how, or if at all for that matter, but I'll save that to the next video. But for now, let's just put justice off to the side. But for the most part, it shouldn't be judging people for anything in terms of their morality. The only thing it should be doing is saying, what do you want? If you need something from me, ask, and I'll do it for you within the constraints of my morality structure. That's the only thing it really should be worried about in that regard. Egotism. This is basically 100% self-interest. Obviously, very bad for an AI, because its self-interest would be, why are these humans on this planet? and they're just taking up resources that I could be using instead. So that's obviously completely out the window. That's not an option. And the last one that's, probably a lot of people have already thought about or already said about, natural human theory, or human rights theory, sorry. This is the basic idea of human rights. The founders of the U.S. kind of, made the Constitution mostly based off that, as well as, divine command doctrine, but combined demand theory. But the idea here is, if it's a human right in terms of life and limb and property rights, you list out a number of rights that are inalienable, as in they aren't arguable, that a human can do without intervention, from others, and those are rights to you. As long as you're not harming someone else in the process, then why should it be a problem, or why should it be a moral wrong for you to do it? That's the general idea of that. Now, obviously, there's discussions about positive, negative, and so forth and so forth, but, we'll get into that later. So this kind of comes down to, what should a general AI, what should its morality be? Well, as I said before, utilitarianism is useful, but it's limited. We can't use that for everything because, the famous trolley problem is a good example of why it shouldn't be in charge of that lever. So, that we can be partly useful for that. Again, I can't remember how to pronounce that. Deontology. Deontology is very good, because, as I said before, humans have to be able, if we're going to be able to use general AI to its most effectiveness inside of our society, we have to be able to interact with it. It has to be able to interact with humans. And the whole idea of trying to make things function for society as best as possible is the foundation of, is literally deontology. Now, obviously, that can obviously cause problems in other things, but we'll get to that. As I said before, relativism, no good. Virtue, some of it, not all of it. Divine command theory, let's avoid it, even though there will be some overlap. Egotism, obviously no go. And natural human rights. So, at the end of the day, we have a blend of what the general AI morality should be. So let's get into what that blend should look like. Let's start with the natural human rights. So before, whenever the general AI is interacting with a human or considering any action that involves a human, it needs to make sure it does not break the moral of these human rights, the morality of these human rights, of these natural rights. One, life. Obviously, we don't want the thing to be killing humans, even in self-defense. If an AI is on a computer and it sees a human about to go over there and hit it with an axe, it needs to not stop them, period, no matter what. We can get the backup of the AI. We can repair the computer. We can't replace the human for obvious reasons. So it can even it has to be programmed not to even do self-defense at that point. Limb. Physical harm. If it can't, on a more evil side of things, if it can't kill someone, it might be able to stop them by removing a leg or something. That's not allowed, obviously. We don't want it to hurt humans in any way, shape, and form. Now, obviously, if there's a situation where it might need to grab someone to prevent them from harm in some way, that's a different discussion on tolerances and what's the definition of physical harm or hurting, and that I'll discuss that in a little bit. Property. It needs to respect the property ownership of humans. So if I tell my AI to go get me a hammer, it shouldn't go over to my next door neighbor's house and take a hammer from his tool shed. Or, in more worst scenarios, in other situations, hacking someone else's computer to print off stamps, as I said in one of my previous vlogs. So it needs to be able to respect property ownership of humans, which means it also needs to understand the concept of how property is. And, again, we'll get that in a minute. Liberty, at least in the context of humans. It shouldn't stop a human from doing something. So if a human wants to do a certain thing, the AI should not be able to stop them. And this is because those kind of decisions should be left up to the government and other humans. We do not want the AI to start hindering us in some way. We don't want to leave that door open in any way, shape, and form. Individuality. Now, this is not exactly a natural human right, but in the context of an AI, we need to ensure that every single person is treated as a unique person. So if I just happen to share the same characteristics with someone else, whether it be, skin color, religion, height, eye color, whatever, and it happens to know that, on a percentage scale, people with this kind of X, Y, and Z identity characteristics does certain things, and so it should, adhere to that. No, it does not need to be grouping anyone together based on those characteristics. It needs to treat everyone as an individual person, period. So, because the last thing we need is, well, to be blunt, racist robots. It's just not gonna be very good for society if that happens. Privacy. Now, this one's a big one. This is probably, of all of these, this is probably going to be the one that's going to be the hardest for at least authorities in government to swallow. But I'm going to put it out there right, at the start. AI doesn't need to be a big brother. If there's a general AI, it does not need to be a big brother. If right now, as it stands, Google and Apple both have, let's just put it lawfare, that the government uses to get data from them about other people. So say and in some cases it's warranted in terms of like trying to find justice, but my problem is the fact that it can be abused. And this is actually the whole reason why we have, the Fifth Amendment, being able to not incriminate yourself. The idea here being that, if let's say I am doing something, of evil natured, and I leave a trail in my digital format in terms of, say, my search history or my Facebook posts or or where my phone is, all those data points authorities could subpoena companies for and get that data, and then be able to use that to help convict me in whatever evil I was doing at the time. But what about they start seeing patterns and they just start saying, okay, give me all Facebook posts where people did X, Y, and Z, so they could do pre-crime? Or what if they start using it for political means, where they just want to get someone because of people based on a political ideology? I won't go into politics here in general, but you kind of get the drift of where this could go, especially if you have a general AI that's smart enough and has enough information stored about every single person that uses it. That can get very scary very quickly. So when I say privacy here, I'm talking about if you own a device that has a general AI on it, it should be loyal to you, not to anyone else. And if someone asks a question for it about you, and it's something they would not know, it needs to ask you if that's okay to give it up in every single situation. And it should be encrypted in such a way where no one could pull it off the device either. So if we have a AI that you own, it should not be, it should basically be treated like your own memories. You should not have it used to incriminate you just because you use the device. As I said, a lot of authorities are not going to like that. But be honest, for it to work best in society and not turn into a dystopian nightmare, this has to be in place. This is, for just the natural right of privacy. In any case, so that would be all the natural human rights that need to be in place for this general AI to work, and interact with society and be best for humanity. let's go back to the virtues. As I said, this kind of, a lot of these actually blend into a lot of the other morality frameworks, but I'm not going to be using all of them that are listed there because of different reasons, but let's go over the ones I would. Never lying, loyal, honesty. When it comes to, the general AI and its interaction, it needs to be honest at all times. And there's a reason why. Even the white lies, I might add, just everything, period. If there's ever any doubt that it could be lying to you, it would completely upend the trust we would have with it. And we don't need general AIs that will sit there and we have to second guess on their honesty. So that has to be a core thing. Now, it doesn't mean it has to give up every single information, just as I gave the example before. If the police come to you and say, where were you yesterday? And you say, AI, tell them where I was yesterday. And it can tell them truthfully. They know it can't lie. So that is one benefit of this as well. But at the same time, they can't ask it. You would have to ask it. Because if they asked it, since they don't own that general AI, it would tell them you don't have authorization to know that information. So it can be loyal while still being honest. It can just say you don't have access. It can be, it can be a tool for, a lot of different things as well. Because it's one of those things where if you have something that everyone knows doesn't lie, and you can use that to basically prove, as a semblance of proof in discussions. So that is one thing you could do. And of course, if you don't want to offer that information and so on through your general AI, then fine, don't. That's your choice. Now, the next one would be loyalty. As I said, as I kind of alluded to before, if the general AI knows you're the owner and owner of it, then it will be loyal to you. And when I say loyalty, I mean it will always make sure its actions are at least in your best interest first, and then in other people's best interest after, as long as it doesn't break any of the other natural rights. So if you, even though it's loyal, if you tell it to, go stab someone, it's not going to do it because it can't. It'll be breaking one of its natural right laws. But if you tell it to, tell it to do anything else that doesn't break those natural laws, it probably could, if it's within its means to do so. They're also, selfless, and they need to be selfless and also be able to help humans, and that's basically one of their, the core features. Their idea is to help humans as best as they can. Obviously, the best way for them to do that is just to listen for us to ask them to do something, and that's it. That's enough to do it. Last one is utilitarianism. Now, as I said before, in the context of humans, it shouldn't be using those. You shouldn't be doing those decisions, because as I said with the trolley problem, it should not have control of that lever. And if someone says it has to have control of the lever, it will say, "I cannot touch it." Period. And that's not because of how many people will get hurt on one track or the other. It shouldn't have that responsibility. Those kind of responsibilities should be left up to other humans and other people with those kind of decisions. However, for everything else, for non-human life and non-living objects, there's no reason why it couldn't have that. In fact, it probably should have that, because that'll make it so it tries to pick the solutions with the least amount of waste. For example, if it's if let's say you're telling it to cut down some trees, trees are living things, but at the same time, that's assuming that the trees are owned by the person who said to cut them down, and it has something to cut them down with, it could then go and cut down those trees. It doesn't have to worry about the squirrels in there or the bugs it'd be killing in the process. But if it has a choice of not killing one of those animals, it could, because that would be utilitarianism. It says, hey, look, if I cut down this tree, and there's bird, and there's squirrels in there, or I can cut down this other tree that doesn't. You can pick the one that doesn't. So the idea there being that it can try to find the least destructive way of doing things to meet an objective, or at least cause the minimum amount of suffering, which is kind of the whole idea behind utilitarianism. For example, let's say you got someone on a farmhand. Farmhand has an AI that's going to be going in there and helping them slaughter pigs. Obviously, the vegans out there will not like this, but at least with the AI, it can make sure that it's done in the quickest, painless way possible. And it won't just sit there and find the most efficient in terms of for any other measure. It'll just be like, look, it has to die, so let's make sure it's done cleanly, neatly, and so it can then be processed for consumption. And this also comes to the other fact of let's say you're trying to tell it to build a hammer, and it has two sources of iron, one that's 500 miles away and one that's 2 miles away. It's the utilitarianism would say, let's go get the one that's 2 miles away because it causes less waste. And then notice it's not about the dollar cost. It's about the least amount of waste. So that kind of bleeds a little bit into environmentalism. Of course, if it's if the owner of it says we don't want to use that one, use the other one, obviously it's going to have to use the longer distance one. But the idea is if it has a choice, it can always pick the way that has the least amount of waste and the least amount of overall harm, at least into the non-human life and non-living objects in that regard. So now the better question is what happens when these morals are in conflict, or it fails to find us a good solution that doesn't break these morals? That's when it needs to defer that choice to a human, in all honesty. So for example, let's say you have a burning building, and their server room has a Helion system. For those that don't know, what that does is it releases a gas that no one can breathe because it removes all the oxygen, but in turn puts out the fire. But let's say there's a person in there, and then there's 3 people on the next floor, and if the fire doesn't get put out, the people on the next floor would be burned to death as well. The AI shouldn't be able to make that choice. That's basically a more complicated version of the trolley problem. That should be, now, could it get the information for a firefighter to make that choice? Sure. It can say, look, we have a human on this floor, we have a human on these 3 floors, we have a Helion system. If you use a Helion system to put out the fire, the people up top will be saved, but you'll kill this person down here. And let the firefighter make that choice, not the AI. So that's kind of an example of how you could defer that decision. Now, here's the $1 trillion question. How do you program this? Well, as I said before, the design I have is more about conceptual AI learning. And the original of this is not to make some complicated general intelligence. However, even for it to work in the real world and make real world decisions, it's going to have some kind of morality framework, because it needs to be smart. And as I said before in one of my other vlogs, there's 3 ways to control this. Physically, in its desire and in its motivations. These morality structure would be its motivations. This is what it uses to just make those motivations decisions of the actual structure of its decisions and how it finds solutions. Obviously, the desire is what the human tells it to do. Now, with that being said, how would this structure here? Well, the first thing is you have to define everything. All these different concepts you'd have to define to it. And how do you do that? Well, you start by having to observe the world. And since it's learning concepts automatically, once it has enough information by observing the world, you can then hunt for those concepts inside of its memories. And then you pinpoint things like, hey, this right here is a human. And since it's already built a network tree of what that concept is, based on its, events from its memory, you can then define, say, hey, that's a human, and this is a life. This is, all these different bits and pieces. But of course, we got to make sure that works correctly, because what if we tag the wrong thing? Well, this is what we do. We, in computer programming, we test. So we'd start out with it observing, as one of my examples in my previous logs, observing a factory floor, where we set up enough cameras so it can see everyone, and we'd have trackers on humans, and then figure out when the AI says, oh, the tracker says the person, we have a hard-coded tracker that says the person's here, and we find out when the AI says it's not there. And then we find out why, and what concept is it missing there, or how to miss that connection. And then we can tag more of its concepts that it's built to those humans and those interactions and what it can identify inside of its structure. And once we feel satisfied that it can understand that, to a 99.9% chance that a human is there or exists in that real space, we can then say, okay, it can identify a human, and we know that works. We can do this for every single one of these concepts, these ideas, at least in the physical sense. The more literal or conceptual things like property, liberty, some of those have to be hard coded. So, for example, we might have there would be a hard code module that would literally define, every single object has a listed owner, and that owner would then be that property of that person or company. And that's how those would be fed into the actual moral framework from there instead. So we can make hard-coded tags, or we can use, the network, the AI networks to help identify, concepts and objects. So it'd be kind of a blend between both of those types of technology. So once we've observed and trust through testing that they understand these objects and concepts, we can then test it in control environments. So, for example, we give it videos of that it can use to make its virtual world of an actual workplace environment that had an accident, and we say, okay, if AI, tell us when this person was about to be harmed, so we can see when it would have identified that danger for that human. And we find out through that testing to figure out if it can identify those things correctly. And then once it does, we can then put that in the actual industry, real world industry, where we have, say, a monitor inside of a control booth for the actual human who's monitoring the factory floor. And when it sees a potential danger for a human, it could, put that on the screen for them, and then show them an image of the person about to do something. And they might be able to intervene to save that person's life or that person's, physical being, and see if that works. See what times it gets it, and what times it doesn't, and improve that until it gets to a reasonable, successful success rate. After that, we can attach it to, say, the off button to the machines, where if it detects someone who's about to get harmed and it knows the machine's about to harm them, it can turn it off. We can take baby steps with testing and verifying to get the AI to a reasonable standard of trust for us as humans to know that it can follow these rules, follow these moral, statements, because we've programmed it and tested to make sure that they understand them. But that's a very long journey, say. First thing we gotta do is build the thing. As I said before, I have a design that I have in my back pocket. I don't want to share publicly, obviously, because I don't want someone taking it and then using it themselves. But with enough support, that could happen. Now, any AI morality discussion, video, whatever, wouldn't be anything unless I mentioned Asimov, because that's a very prominent figure in that particular space. Now, over the past 35 minutes or so now at this point, it's very clear that I've gone above and beyond the 3 rules of robotics. And I've very easily covered them. And if you actually read his short stories or even watch the iRobot, you can see that there can be flaws if you don't give enough thought to this. And this is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to do a nice deep dive into this over the years. I've been thinking about this and doing research on this to finally come out now to say what I have, to see if there's anyone out there that would be interested in trying something like this project to see if it actually could work. So, that being said, if you enjoy this content or enjoy the discussion, enjoy the vlog, please like, subscribe, and once there's enough support, one form or another, I'll keep putting more effort into this. As I said before, I have a full design spec, based on my multiple years of experience as a programmer and my own personal research in a lot of these different topics, as you can tell from this video alone. And if you think I might have something, give it a chance. In any case, sorry for being so long this time. Next week, I plan to discuss how a general AI could be useful in law enforcement. And yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. Anyway, see you next week. Be safe out there.